And now back to Amador Live on 5.
Welcome back, everybody. You're watching TSPN's Amador Live. Tomorrow is Veterans Day.
That's right.
And Jim Switzer is here. Jim's a Korean War veteran.
Yes, I am.
Good morning, Jim.
Good morning.
Pleased to meet you. And today we're going to talk about your experience in the Korean War, and in particularly the Chosin Reservoir battle.
Yes.
And now let's I guess start with why you were a Marine.
Yes.
You are a Marine.
Yes, I have been.
Yes. And why the Marines in this particular battle?
Without going into a long dissertation of sorts, the Marines really were the only ones that were ready in 1950 when we decided to get into the Korean business to begin with. And so it fell upon the Marine Corps because we had a force in readiness, as they call it these days, able to go. And that was really the 5th Marines out of Camp Pendleton.
Now, was that because some of the other departments were still licking their wounds from World War II?
And we were very Europe-oriented at that point in time, foreign policy-wise, and many of our troops and what have you had been sent to the European theater because of the problems with the then days Russian situation. So
now the United Nations then, like now, was very involved in
Right.
the orchestration of this. Tell us about that strategy.
Our president at that time was very impressed with the United Nations and anxious that we make a good showing, at least as I understood it, because we'd kind of messed up in the World War I business, the League of Nations and all. So
right.
When the time came and the events of the day were that the North Koreans basically had moved into South Korea, and this was June the 25th of 1950, I think Mr. Truman was determined that we weren't going to make the same mistake that we had made previously. So when he decided to commit us and the United Nations, after they had appealed to the United Nations that they wanted to help the South Koreans, then we were the only ones, that is to say the Marines were the only ones that were ready right then to go.
I see. I see.
Because normally it would have been an Army kind of an affair, which eventually it wound up being, although the Marines stayed right through the whole thing.
Right. Now let's put this on the map for people. The Chosin Reservoir, as we look at the Korean Peninsula, where on the peninsula would that be?
Is there any way we can look at the maps? Oh, okay. It's in North Korea.
In the north, yeah.
Yeah, and it is one of 2 big reservoirs just south, essentially, of Manchuria. There's a good one right there that you can see. Can I point to that thing, or?
Let's see. We can see it there.
Okay.
Yeah, it's in
anyway,
the box,
it's up in North Korea, and we had crossed basically the 38th parallel. There was a great deal of deliberation on the part of General MacArthur and the United Nations as to what they wanted to do. And in the interim period, a lot of the forces moved northward, and their strategies eventually was to have one army group, which was the 8th Army, on the west side of the Korean Peninsula, and then the 10th Army group, or the 10th Corps, kind of on the east side. And the Marines were assigned to the 10th Corps as a part of the Army overall command. And that was the reason that we went northward. We were to go to Manchuria, and we were going right up the mountain range, the Taebaek mountain range, and I don't think at that point in time anybody realized what the terrain was like or what the weather was going to be. So
now the Marines at this point were a defensive force, if I'm not mistaken. The Chinese were coming in?
We didn't know that at that time.
Oh, you didn't know?
That was the big surprise.
I see.
This is one of the big errors of sorts of the whole Korean business, that the intelligence of sorts really didn't filter through from Tokyo back to Korea in terms of what was happening. We didn't really see any Chinese until October of 1950, and the fact that they were Chinese was pretty well discounted in the Tokyo headquarters, that no, these were just a few survivors or volunteers or something. Meanwhile, of course, they'd moved 300,000 Chinese soldiers just north of the Yalu River, and they were all basically, well, they weren't bivouac, but they were there. but nobody knew they were there. They weren't spotted by the air, and so we kept moving north because that was the push from General MacArthur's headquarters. Keep going to the Yalu River. The idea being eventually you'd have all of the North Koreans out of North Korea, and you would decommunize that part of the country, if that was correct. But it didn't work that way because fundamentally the Chinese were very concerned about their industries and what have you in Manchuria.
Sure.
With that force of people getting close, they were very nervous about it.
Absolutely.
And the United Nations was forewarned basically by the Indians and one other group that this probably was not a good thing, but we kept right on going. And on the 27th of November, the Chinese forces had crossed basically the Yalu River in force. So there were perhaps 300,000 or so. And at this point in time, the 5th Marines, and in a Marine unit or in a Marine division, there would be 3 regiments. One regiment was on one side of the reservoir. We were on the other side. The other regiment was strung out along this little, what they so-called road, which was really a trail, to try to protect it from people coming down on either side. So we were strung out rather badly. It was a real concern for our general, O.P. Smith. But the Army general was a chap by the name of Almond, and he wanted us to keep right on going. He wasn't too concerned, so we did what we were told, I reckon.
Well, Jim, you were there. Was it a war or a conflict?
I'd say war.
Yeah.
A lot of people got hurt.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a lot of people got frozen too.
And absolutely, and you know, we a lot of attention has been given to World War II, you know, rightfully so.
Oh, yes.
And Vietnam, but Korea just recently is really getting the attention it deserves, wouldn't you say?
It has developed into a lot more of a critical situation for us as a nation than it was before, because we've never really focused on the Pacific area. Now, of course, with the developments in Japan and in China, the whole focus has shifted. And
yes. What should we be doing in Korea now?
Let the Koreans settle their affairs and get on with their lives.
So let the North and the South work it out. And,
yes.
And leave it to that.
I think so.
Very good. Is there, as we start thinking about veterans beginning tomorrow for this one day a year, would you recommend any information or places for people to go to learn more about Korea and that war?
Well, our libraries have many more books than they've ever had, and of course many of the service associations have little brochures and things. I had one somewhere. Here's one written by a fellow in Tennessee, and there are a lot more of brochures and short books, pamphlets, if you will, about the whole deal than there ever were before.
Very good. Jim Switzer, thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
And
Thank you for your patience.
Well, we appreciate your service to our country. Thank you very much for being on the show. We're going to take a quick little break. We'll be back in just a minute. Stick with us. You're watching Amador Live.
Thank you for coming to join us.